Hello, welcome to our video for Shield of the Sun, in which this video is about explanations into certain photographs. And so we're going to be talking about the Nephilim, and we're going to be talking about what the Nephilim is, and we're going to talk about the evidence that has been found in terms of the skeletal remains of these beings. So when we talk about a Nephilim is actually a being that is half angelic and half human. It is a being that was born from a human womb, either through the normal way or through some type of test tube way. And these beings are usually genetically altered to appear certain ways. And so there's a lot of different varieties of Nephilim I want to mention. And the ones we're going to be specifically talking about are the ones the Bible calls the giants. And so a lot of people often wonder, well, if the giants existed, wouldn't there have been skeletal remains of these creatures? Now, to tell you the truth, even if there wasn't skeletal remains, I would still believe they were because God said they were. But the truth is also there are skeletal remains of it for those that don't have as much faith as others, because the Bible is real regardless of if you believe in it or not. Actually, the Bible doesn't care rather if you believe in it or not, because it's real. What we're doing here is showing those who appreciate this truth some of these skeletal remains that we think deserve some explanation, because I'm sure many of you may have seen these pictures, or many of you haven't. But I think it's really good if we give a little detailed discussion about some of these. And much of my study, it also involves archaeology and study of human anatomy as well. And so what we're basically looking at here is a skeletal remain of a Nephilim giant. And it's a very large skeletal. It's probably close to maybe 13 to 16 feet tall, this particular one. And it seems to have died in some type of either through a catastrophe. We think it died in the flood, actually. And so what we're looking at here is basically the skeletal remains of this creature. These creatures were very, very numerous in the time of Noah. They were known as flesh giants. I don't know how many of you knew that. There were two different types of giants. There were Pacific type of giants in the time of Enoch, and then there were Pacific type of giants in the time of Noah. And these giants were considered to be the result of the unholy relationships between the human sons of God and the daughters of men, who were once the wives of the fallen angels, who were known as witches, into which that name came about because they were the wives of the watchers. And so these were their children, is what you're looking at. You're looking at actually one of their children. And apparently, if we look right here, he's holding something there. I don't quite know what he's holding there, but he's basically gripped for some type of catastrophe. And I don't think he was a pretty person, actually. I don't think these beings, in fact, I know that these beings were very violent beings. They were very mentally unstable. They were very selfish, greedy, murderous. They were idol worshippers, pagan worshippers. They very much were aware of where they came from, who their father was, and who they are, basically. And you got to understand one thing: whether they're Nephilim giants or Nephilim aliens, these things hate the human race. They literally hate us. They rather just eat us. They can't stand us in any degree. Now, I want to talk a little bit about this photograph right here. You've probably seen this photograph, or maybe you know this type of story where they're trying to say that the giant that was actually found in this pit here was not real. Well, this photograph that you're looking at is a doctrine photograph. The skeletal remain has been already removed. And so they're just trying to show that this is just a pit and that there was nothing in there. But the fact is, there was once an 80-foot giant inside this pit that had just been removed. These skeletal remains that are on top actually have been superimposed upon this photograph. And so you're probably wondering, why am I showing this photograph then? And that's because it's to teach you about disinformation. Some of these photographs are not real. Some of them have been doctrined or blurred out or faked for a purpose. It's to blind you from the real photographs that are out there. So be very, very careful about that, because the fact is that these skeletal remains are out there, and I don't know if you know this or not, but over 300 of these skeletal remains have been found. And so these photographs, these specific ones that I'm mentioning, are basically used to make you think that this is some type of hoax and things like that. And it's to try to make the Bible untrue. It's to try to make the God that you believe in not true. It's to take your faith away. So don't let anybody take your faith away simply because they like to use technology to mess with your head. That's not cool. So what you're looking at here is basically a disinformation photograph. There was an actual giant that was in the midst of this, and some of his body is actually still in the water. And so we're going to go to the next photograph, and you see a more closer up of it. Now this guy right here was taken from the original photograph that actually showed the giant being. So this is actually another doctrine photograph. It's to take real surroundings, as you can see right here, and then just take these red type of bones that are actually not in the original photograph. These specific bones were superimposed upon the real skeletal remains that are in the water. And so most of it has been removed, so most of his body is still there. And so this is another example, another close-up shot of this disinformation photograph. So bear in mind that there are photographs of real giants that have been disappeared or removed, or have been something else has been superimposed upon them, so that you're not accustomed to the reality of the Bible. Now this is a real picture actually, and this is another picture of a giant that was found. We believe this picture came from India, and which giants have been found not just in India but all over the world. They've been found in North America, they've been found in Europe, they've been found in Africa, Russia, Central China. They have been found everywhere. And so what we're looking at right here is a giant that's estimated to be somewhere between 13 to 12 feet tall. Further evacuation has shown that this giant died violently, and apparently he was murdered of some kind. And the way he was buried suggested also that he was buried alive. And so this was a giant that went through some violent occurrences before he was taken out. This is another photograph of a giant, and this is a very, very big giant. I want you to take a very good look at the man working on the spinal bone. If you look at the spinal bone, this small part of the spinal bone is actually far bigger than the 6-foot human being working on him. And this man here is also close to maybe about 6 feet. And if you take a very good look at the jaw of this creature, it's far bigger than this man. This skeletal remain is one of the hugest skeletal remains ever found. This giant is estimated to be somewhere between 100 to 120 feet tall when he lived. That is very, very big. And it shows very clearly the kind of world that Noah beheld, the kind of menace that threatened the humans back then, why the flood was so necessary. Because by the time the flood came, there wasn't too many humans left on the earth, and the humans that were left on the earth were very much tainted and evil. That earth actually had more beings like this and Nephilim beings running around at that time, because when the sons of God betrayed their position, they gave themselves over to satanic beings who eventually took over. And so what we have here are the results of that and why the flood was so necessary. I mean, when you think very clearly about it, do you want to live in a world where you're confronted with something like that? Think about it. The humans were very much confronted with things like this, were killed by beings like this, eaten by beings like this, and had to answer to beings like this. And not just in Noah's time, but even after the flood, these beings reappeared again. And so this is the kind of threat that human beings were accustomed to. And so this giant is very massive. It's very huge. It has not been fully clear how he specifically died, other than there's a hole in the ubla andagata, the brain center of this being. And what we have there, this specific hole right here, is suggesting that this giant died violently, that somebody basically shot something into his head. It's been believed that in the old world they had advanced technology back then, so that could have been how he died. And so basically he was murdered. And probably because, he's an evil being, he's just basically one evil person murdering another seems to have been how he was brought to his end. Okay, so welcome to part 2 of our video. We're still discussing the Nephilim giants. If you haven't seen part 1, I suggest to please go back and watch part 1 so you can kind of catch up to what we're talking about here and to this important subject about giants and the Nephilim giants specifically that existed. So this next video here is from the 19th century, the 1800s. These gentlemen that you see around here are the elite of America, basically. And what they were doing was they were uncovering giant human beings that were found in the North American lands. And so what they found, from what I understand, is that they found coffins of these beings. And many of these beings were being evacuated. Basically, they were being dug up and removed. And the elite had a special interest in seeing these beings covered up. And that had a lot to do with the fact that evolution was on the rise in the 19th century. The elite were very much pushing the evolution agenda. They wanted that to be taught as fact in the schools. It eventually was turned into teaching, even though it's nothing but a religious faith to believe in evolution in the first place. It's a change of faith. It's a rejection of Jesus Christ for, the embrace of a New Age religion. And so what we have in the 19th century was that they were trying to cover up as much evidence as they could about the biblical God and about the accounts. Because the truth is, God does not suffer himself to man's Gestapo tactics, if you will. God does not answer to man. Man answers to him. But things have been left that have shown the truth of his word, and these men right here were looking to take that away from you, cover that up, and now their sons and their daughters of today are doing the same thing. So what we have here is evidence of that. There's a lot of pictures that are out there like that shows these men knew about these beings and purposely decided to cover it up. What we have here is another picture from a while back. This looks to have been sometime in the late 19th century or early 20th century. This particular being was found near Israel, and it was known to be an Ammonite. Ammonites are the people that were one of the last groups of people that worshiped Moloch, and they were a specific target from the army of David, who, by the command of God, he went to war against the pagan nations. So if you want to get a good look at the kind of beings David and his army had to fought, take a very good look at it. If there were beings like this that were in existence, this is kind of like the thing with Goliath and everything else. But of course, this being is actually bigger than Goliath, which is saying a lot. This being stood about maybe 18 to 20 feet tall, and it was a being that ate children. And it was a being that worshipped Moloch, basically. It believed to have descended from a being, demon spirit, basically. And so what it is basically that, a lot of these Ammonite giants were known as the sons of Anak. You will find that in the Bible. They were known as the Anakim. And a lot of the Anakim had their kingdom basically decimated by other pagan cultures, which caused a lot of these giants to become the champions of other cultures. So this was one of the Ammonite champions, into which his cause was defending child murder and infanticide and things like that the Ammonites were doing. So this is to give you a very good glimpse at the kind of beings that the Israelites had to fight, why that war was so necessary. People often wonder, why was God so, they'll say slanderous things in terms of the fact that they'll accuse God of exterminating people just to exterminate them, and that's not the case at all. God labeled them and designed punishment and sentence for their execution because of the intense murders and the intense horrors and the intense nightmarish kingdoms that they inflicted and poured upon people. So you got to understand that these beings hate the human race, and they were committing the most horrific and nightmarish crimes upon the human race that they had to be stopped. And God used David's army to do that. And these beings were not going to stop by asking them. They were so evil that they had to be exterminated. And the humans who followed beings like this, or basically evil spirits in general, were just as bad, if not worse. What we have here is the original photograph of that disinformation photograph that you were shown. And so this is actually the original photograph, and this is actually what they try to cover up. This is an actually 80-foot giant. It is huge. And this photograph here was actually an original photograph that has been slandered. A lot of people try to say it was a contest and this and that. All of that is completely untrue, because they have this actual giant hanging in an Indian museum. It was actually found in that area, and everything in Indian publication and within their government will literally show you that it's a real skeletal being that was actually found, evacuated, and removed to a museum. And the only way you can see giantoskeletons, you have to go out of this country in order to see them. There's a place in Italy where you can see them, there's a place in India where you can see them, and there's a place in Turkey where you can see them. And so this giant is believed by the Indian people to have been the son of one of their gods that they believed in. And there's a little truth to that. The fact is that the gods of the Nephilim were worshipped back then, and the Nephilim themselves were worshipped as gods too. I mean, when you look at an 80-foot human being, and you don't know too much about the real God, that would tempt you to worship them. So there was real cause why these people worshiped them, but that was because they didn't have spiritual knowledge of Jesus Christ, who said he was from the beginning. So don't ever get this twisted. The Son of God was known in the old world. And so what we have here, if you take a good look at this man right here, he's almost as big as this being's head. That's saying quite a bit. This guy is not even as big as the side of this being's face or head. That to me is phenomenal. That being right there is something I would probably run to the hills from, because it was very much an evil being. We even know how it died. Actually, its chest cavity was actually broken in, and to which somebody took a weapon and basically bashed his chest in, which probably would have stabbed his heart, causing him eternal bleeding. So he died violently, basically. And so it's just amazing. It was just an amazing find that was so overwhelming that the evolutionists and the American government on this end, that have an agenda to teach what they want you to know and hide the true information, really didn't want people knowing about. It was too much for them, and they were very much scared that if you came to really understand the reality that these beings exist, that these beings are real, and that they're there, and that they've been found, that would completely destroy your belief in the American education system in terms of evolution, which it should, by the way, because they're lying to you, and they should be confronted for that, because that's not cool to take people and lie to them. This is another skeletal remain, and it's another big threat that people had were very much afraid of people to find. I've actually seen photos of this where the skeletal remains was removed actually completely. And so it's another way to blind you. But this photograph is actually real, and it's a real skeletal remain. It's not as big as the one prior. This giant is believed to be close to maybe 18 to 20 feet tall. And he basically is believed to have died through a sacrificial way. If you notice the way he's turned and the way he seems to be concentrated with his head down, seems that he was either held down or he was either turned away from some type of horrific thing that was happening to his body. It's believed that he had his blood drained out of his body. So that has a lot of reference to sacrificial murder, and to which ritualistic pagan sacrifices are very much known to drain the blood of their victims to drink it. And so he seems to have died in that type of capacity, and the only way that could have probably happened is that if his other giant brothers decided to sacrifice one of their own, to which they were known to do that. This is another giant that was found. He died in the flood, actually, and was fossilized into the rock. And so when people talk about fossils and things like that, I'm sure you've heard all the garbage from Jurassic Park and whatever that is. The fact is that fossils are real, but fossils actually come from the old world. And they didn't come from billions and billions of years ago either. Try more like thousands of years ago. And they just basically are things that have been destroyed in the flood. And so what you have here is a giant who was praying at the time when he died. And he was basically praying to one of his gods to save him from the catastrophe that was happening all around him. And when that flood came, when you see basically 1,000 feet tidal waves coming down on you, and they're coming from the sky, that would send you on your knees, people. I don't care how big you are, you're going to go on your knees. That's going to put you right on your knees. And since this giant had no hope for salvation because it's an abominable being, it basically prayed to the only thing it knew, which was the devil. And of course the devil didn't save him because the devil didn't have power to. And so it basically died in the flood. It was drowned, and it got fossilized right in the rock. This adventurous man right here was the one who found it. He's an American. And keep that in mind. There are many, many American archaeologists who are very much finding out that these beings existed, that they have been discovered in very large numbers, and that there are species of them, and that they have record accounts of how they died and what happened to them. And they have been fighting almost an endless battle putting this to the American people. They're trying to bring an American museum to our country to show these giants and the evidence of the Bible to what's supposed to be Christian America, who believes in the Bible but yet rejects the truth that's right there in front of their face. Thank God there are some pious Americans in this land who recognize when they've been lied to and have the courage to come forward. So ups to this man right here for finding him. Okay, so welcome to part 3 of our video about the Nephilim. If you haven't watched part 1 or 2, please go back and watch part 1 and 2 so you can become accustomed to what we are speaking on here, in which we are showing Nephilim videos. And so our next video here is a Nephilim skeletal remain that was put on display in a public square in Italy. And as I mentioned before, Italy has a Nephilim museum of Nephilim skeletons. And these skeletons are on display in this Italian museum. And one of the things that they did was that when they unearthed a specific skeleton, they decided to basically clean them up, polish them up, and then basically put them on display so that the people can get a very good view on how big these giants were, and just, you know, what it would have been like if you had to confront one of these beings. So let's take a look at this guy as he's laying down here. And this is something a lot of Americans, don't know. They don't know that there are beings that are actually put on display in other countries for you to see. And so that's an interesting thing to know, because if you're into tourism, if you're into traveling, I suggest you go to Italy, and because you might see some things that you weren't taught in school. And so if we take a good look at just this being's feet, if you take a look at some of the people walking by, this thing was far bigger than its very feet were far bigger than just the average person. This giant actually, it was close to about 22 feet tall, and it's a very massive being. It had a deformed nose, as you can see right here, and it's just huge. It's just very huge, and just had been a scary experience. I don't know quite how our ancestors handled it. I really don't. It's hard enough for us to handle aliens when they want to come mess with us. I can only imagine what this must have been like. So it's a very fascinating study, and it's unfortunately it's a very evil being. This is another giant that was found. It was found actually inside of its tomb, if you will, into which it was buried under there. And from what I understand about this giant is that it is close to about 16 feet tall, and it was murdered. And from what I understand, a very powerful weapon actually shattered his cranium, left a big hole right there in his cranium, as you can see. And this giant was actually, into which it's interesting to mention that out of the 300 skeletons that have been found, most of them have died through head trauma. It's interesting. There are two ways that many of these flesh giants died. They were either violently murdered, meaning they were shot in the head, actually. Yes, there was actually lead resin found in their skeletal remain, meaning somebody had a gun thousands of years ago, or some type of weapon that fired a bullet-like capacity and put one right in his head, basically. And so that is the way this giant died. And to which I think I've mentioned this before, that the Bible tells us that there is nothing new under the sun, and as it was in the time of Noah, so shall it be in our time. That means ancient technology was around back then. That means guns were around back then, unfortunately. And that's how this being met its end. It was basically murdered. And the other way that many of these skeletons died is that they were drowned in the flood. So they basically went two ways, and all of them died mostly violent deaths. This is another skeletal remain that was found in Turkey, and it was put on display in one of the Turkish museums that I discussed to you. There's actually American archaeologists working in those Turkish museums. I'll give you a lot of info on these giants, and it's very, very interesting. And so what we have here is it is a hip bone, as we can see right here, of a giant, and this particular hip bone was shown, into which it's trying to show you just how big the being would have to be in order to have a hip bone like this. This giant is estimated to believe somewhere between 15 feet tall, and it's very massive, very huge, and you know, just it's frightening, just very frightening to have to confront something like that. This is another giant that was found, and remember when I was telling you about the gun that these giants or weapons that were used. If you take a very good look at what this giant is holding in his hand, yes, my friends, you're not seeing things. He's holding a gun in his hand. It's a gun specifically designed for this giant too. So what you're looking at is a giant that's estimated to be somewhere between 20 to 30 feet tall, and more like 25 to 30 feet tall would be accurate. And the giant is believed to have died violently. It died gripping this gun in his hand, and basically it was in some type of firefight before it died. And so it really testifies to the violence of Noah's time and how that violence mirrored our own time. They were basically shooting each other down in the old world, and so in Noah's time, of course. And so what we have here is a giant that died or met its end in that way. This is the entire cave or tomb area, if you will, and basically it was uncovered. And if you take a good look at this bulldozer that's right next to it, this is the bulldozer that was used in digging it up. Basically they were digging one layer of dirt like this after another, because they were basically told there was a tomb down there, but they just didn't expect to find him. And so when they dug him out, if you take a good look at this bulldozer, it's nowhere near as big as this giant. This giant's head actually is about half the size of this bulldozer. And so if you get a real good grasp of how big this being must have been, it could literally pick this bulldozer up and just throw it over a hill. That's how big these beings were. That's how much strength they had. And I can only imagine how big this gun must have been. It was a gun designed for him. So, you know, that thing would just blow holes in buildings, basically. This is another picture of another giant that was found. It's actually the same giant from what I understand. And if you take a good look, this is after they evacuated. Basically, this is after they dug them up. After the digging, you notice that, you know, the bulldozer's gone, everything is gone, you know. There's something blurred right here. Now, what do you think is blurred there? That's actually the weapon that he was actually found with. So this photograph was actually tainted, meaning it was messed with. You do have two actual people there. This man is actually evaluating the gun in the giant's hand. He's actually blown away that there's a gun in his hand. And he doesn't quite understand how it could have came up there, you know, because the understanding he had was that guns weren't around back then, but Lord behold, there it is. And so they're just basically looking at this being, and they kind of quite don't understand why it's there. And yes, this photograph has been doctored up, and I just want to mention a few things here. This is an actual real photograph from the original one that we showed you, but there are things that have been added to it so that it would just throw you off, so that it would make you think altogether it's a fake photograph, so why bother with it? Well, there's a lot you need to bother with it, because this is a real photograph that has fake things implanted in there. And so what we have here is the main thing is this blur spot right here, this blur spot that's purposely done so that it will hide originally what you saw. Like if you look back here, what we have here is his weapon, and if you look up here, it's now been blurred. And also if you look here, the tomb area is more straight, it's more, you know, it's basically more squared. And if we look here, this has also been tainted very much here too. So the image, this center point image, was taken from this photograph and implanted upon that photograph. And the reason why they do that is because it's to confuse you, it's to mislead you. It's similar to what they've done with some of the moon photographs. It's to take what was real and put it onto something fake so that you would be thrown off from the truth. So never get it twisted. You know, what we have here is a real occurrence being messed with. So never ever get it twisted. These people will lie to you, and they will do everything they can to lie to you, and they will trick you till the sun goes up or down. They do not stop until their tongues are pulled out. Okay, this is part 4 of our video on the Nephilim, and so please go back to watch the first 3 videos so you can kind of get a real good glimpse on what we're talking about here. And so our next photograph here is a pharaoh. It's an Egyptian giant, and he's probably close to about 9 feet tall, and not as big as the other giants, of course, but basically it's important to talk about some of these Egyptian pharaohs, because some of these Egyptian pharaohs were giants actually. And this had a lot to do with the fact that the Egyptians, the royal Egyptians I should say, had a direct pipeline to evil spirits. They talked to evil spirits. They had evil spirits living in their kingdoms. How many of you knew that? If you look at a lot of the Egyptian hieroglyphics, you'll find what are known as aliens on those hieroglyphics, which are actually demon spirits. And a lot of them were manipulating the wombs of their women, and specifically some of the princesses that would give birth to rulers. And so when they did that, a lot of the physical changes started to take place on those babies. A lot of those babies were born, and they grew to very huge heights. A lot of their heads were grown to a very oblong shape. And so a lot of these pharaohs actually were giants worshipped as gods. And so very tripped out thing. And so this was one of them right here. And if you notice the way he's buried, and in that way pharaohs buried crossway like that, that also had a signification with the mark of Cain as well. And this is another giant that was found, into which it's found in its proper tomb area, into which basically the area right here, if you look at this whole entire area, into which this was a mix of Indian and American archaeologists who were at a hotspot into which they found a tomb area of these giant beings. And so this whole area that they're standing on actually is one giant tomb, and they were taking it out square by square by square. And so every time they would uncover some squares, the heads of these skeletal giant remains were found. And so it was a very long project. It was about a month or so before they were able to really dig down deep and take a lot of them out of there, into which a lot of these tomb areas have been found, very big, massive tomb areas that were found underneath the ground. Some of them were actually found underneath the water, and had skeletal remains of these huge giants. And this specific giant that's sticking out right here, he's estimated to be close to about 26 feet tall, and he's very huge. And this find right here was very exciting for these 2 American archaeologists, because they were hoping to find something like that and to run into it, and they got their wish. This is another giant that was found. We're not quite sure what area this is, but we believe it's Italy. We don't know what area in Italy, but we know the country is Italy. These are Italians actually, and what they're doing is that they found a giant skeletal remains on their land, into which there have been a lot of skeletons found in Italy. Italy is another hotspot where these beings were found. And so it's interesting enough that what they did is that a lot of the Italian villagers used to find these skeletal remains, used to take them to a warehouse where they stored them. And that's basically what they're doing. And the reason why it's such a push, because, well, not only are the hills steep in Italy, but the fact that these skeletal remains weighed a lot too. They were very heavy to lift around, and their bones were quite heavy. This is a Nephilim. It's not a giant, but it's another breed of a Nephilim, something that we've been talking about. And we do understand that the Canaanites actually were born with deformities. Some of them were born looking vampiric, some of them were born with horns, like this being here, and some of them were born with fur all over their body. But, you know, and not all of them, but it was something that did occur among Canaanites. We think this is a Nephilim. And because simply due to the fact that the rest of the skull, if you look more closer right here, it's very oblong. It doesn't have a human formation. So this is another breed of a Nephilim, another type of Nephilim, if you will. And basically it has horns. It's a basically goat-looking being. Not something you'd want to invite over for coffee, that's for sure. This is another giant skeletal remain that was found underneath the water. It's actually a tomb that they found of him. It was in his coffin when they found him. And so basically he was unearthed. And these deep sea divers, actually this particular gentleman filming him, didn't go down there for that reason. They actually just ran into him. And so they found this huge discovery, and they started to break out the film and start filming him. From what we understand, he appears to have died in the flood and was just submerged underneath the water. These are a couple of Nephilim giants that were found in India, and it's a pair of them. They seem to have died together, and they also show signs that they also died in the flood. There was no indication other than them just basically drowned in this most deserved catastrophe that happened to the earth at the time, something that broke God's heart to do, but at the same time most of the people on the earth weren't even his children. And so in fact, this is what he had to really take out right here, these things that people were serving. This is a more up-close shot of these two. And these two gentlemen right here were part of the Indian evacuation team, basically, or Indian archaeology team, meaning they're not archaeologists, they're actually laborers. And they were hired by archaeologists to unearth these beings. A lot of these skeletal remains were found on the shores or in desert areas in India, or the hot places of India, mostly around the shores. And what happened was that there was a tsunami that took place in India not too long ago. Many people remember it. And after the effects of that tsunami, a lot of these skeletal remains started popping up. And so basically they were brought, basically a lot of the dirt was brought down to bring these beings up. And so yes, these beings basically show that they died in the flood. They are estimated to be 18 to 20 feet tall. What we have here are two Nephilim giants that were found laying together, and what we have is a male and a female giant. And this is the female right here, and this is the male right here. I want to make it very clear that female giants were very, very rare in the old world, from what I understand. They were not numerous, and so it was very rare for a giant to have a mate. And so when they did have a mate, they were very close to that mate. They held on to that mate like butter. It was, very rare to get. And so these two die together, basically. And if you're thinking how romantic, think again. They were very evil beings, obviously, and evil beings who were about to meet their end. And so I don't have any sympathy for them, because the Bible sanctioned them to have no salvation, not because God felt like being mean. That had a lot to do with these beings were pure evil, and you don't want beings like that in heaven. This is another Nephilim photograph. It's our final one here. And this photograph here was taken during an Israeli evacuation, an archaeological project that took place there. They were actually digging under surfaces to get more of a glimpse into the tunnel formations of ancient Jerusalem. And it turned out that in many of these tunnel areas, they actually buried things in those tunnels. Some of them had to do with the giants. You see, when the Israelites killed a giant, they usually cut its head off. And when they did that for a trophy. That was like a trophy to them. It was, it was to show the glory of God, this human being taking down this massive being. And so when they did that, they would make trophies of the heads of these giants, and they would place them in certain areas that were in underground cabins. One of these cabins had been discovered, and this is one of the heads of these giants that the Israelites took. And we'd like to thank you for watching our video, and we hope you learned something.